Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Gallery Aferro, the Queer.Newark Oral History Project, and the Departments of History and African American and African Studies at Rutgers Newark, warmest welcome to Ancestors at Play, Audacity and Visibility in the Queer Black Archive. We extend our deep gratitude to Alanna Fields, Noelle Lorraine Williams, Naomi Extra, and Beryl Satter for taking time to share their work and vision with us this evening. And we thank all of you for tuning into what we are sure will be a dynamic conversation about Black representation in arts and how Black queer representation has been historically obscured. Very brief mentions before I turn the virtual mic over to Emma Wilcox, who will talk a bit about the work happening at and the opportunities with Gallery Aferro. This event is being recorded for our archive and will be made available on our Queer.Newark YouTube channel. You will see the links in the chat, and we hope you'll subscribe and follow our social media accounts to learn more about our programs and events of interest. Closed captioning is enabled. To view, click on the closed caption or the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to display subtitles or to view a full transcript. To ensure the comfort of everyone participating today, chat messages and questions are only visible to speakers, but we look forward to all of your questions and comments. So please enter them in the Q&A or the chat box, and our panelists will try and answer as many live as time allows. With that, Emma, the mic is yours, and thank you all so much.
Thank you, Christina. I am ecstatic to be here tonight and to introduce myself. I'm Emma Wilcox, and I'm the co-founder of Gallery Aferro. We are the oldest artist-run space operating here in Newark. Almost 20 years ago, my partner Yvonne M. Davis and I started Aferro here in Newark. And we do all kinds of work. We do exhibits and events and legacy work with cultural elders. We do public art initiatives, interactive new media installations. We have a publication line. But tonight comes out of Aferro's life as an artist workspace, as a longtime running studio residency program in downtown Newark. And the artists who participate there are part of a kind of dynamic, multi-generational, accessible community. 6 years ago, something really exciting happened, which is we were able to establish fellowships at Gallery Aferro. So these are opportunities for artists to have a fully funded studio and a stipend. And our hope is all of the sort of cultural and intellectual gravitas that comes with the word fellowship that's implied in that word, all of the possibility implied in the meanings of that word. So we have the Sustainable Arts Fellowship, which is for artists who are parents. And we have the Lynn and John Kearney Fellowship for Equity. That is for women artists of color in support of racial, gender-based, and economic justice. It's for women artists of color of any age. And creating the fellowship, making it exist, was a creative and intentional act against the sort of inertia of the status quo. It's work I'm really, really proud of. And I hope that if this is of interest to you or people you know, you won't be shy about looking us up. Because these are ongoing fellowships that are being offered on an ongoing basis. And the fellowships, in no small part, come out of our kind of collaborative ethos. So I'm reflecting very gratefully this evening on a lot of work with different parts of and people connected with Rutgers Newark, and just reflecting on the fact that Aferro has had a connection to Queer Newark before there was Queer Newark, the project. So these are all things I'm really proud of tonight. And I just, again, extend my thanks to Alanna Fields, our 2020 Fellow for Equity, and to Noelle and Naomi and Beryl for making this evening possible. And again, to Christina, this is just an abundance of brilliant women in the room. So thank you very, very much.
Okay, well, welcome again, everyone. And I'll say that I'm teaching a class right now called History of the Future, Visions of Utopia and Dystopia in the US. And my students looked at all three of your websites, Naomi, Alanna, and Noelle, for the class. And for today's class, they also read Black to the Future, the interview with Samuel Delaney and Trish Rose and Greg Tate. And so they came up with questions for you guys. And I want to just throw out a few of them to start. And then I'm happy, if Noelle said she might want to show a piece of her work, which is fine if she'd like. But let me just start with one question that it sort of combines a few different questions from a few of my students. And it has to do with your thoughts on African-American history as a resource for creating a better future. And including especially the almost entirely obscured history of Black women and Black queer women's political, sexual, emotional, and artistic expression. So, like I said, this week my class had an interview with the great novelist, science fiction writer Samuel Delaney in Black to the Future, and he talked about how envisioning Black futures is essential, and especially essential because of the erasure of Black history and the destruction of ancestral ties to Africa. So, with that in mind, and given that all of your work, all three of you do so profoundly engage with these questions, can you just each say something about your artistic, scholarly, or activist take on our theme for today, which is Ancestors at Play, Audacity and Visibility in the Queer Archive? It's such a wonderful title, and I'm wondering how each of you think your work fits that title. So maybe we could start with Alanna, who's next to me on my screen.
Sure. Thank you all for having me. This is great. I think as an artist and as an archivist, but also just as a Black woman and a Black queer woman, Black Americans have a very complicated relationship with history as a result of white erasure. And Black women and Black queer women experience that tenfold. And so at the center of my artistic practice and my practice as an archivist is amplifying Black queer history, bringing that to the forefront and creating visibility around that through my engagement with photographic archives and things of that sort. I think history and archives and ephemera and things like that serve as little pieces of memories of our existence. And what we risk at that erasure or not excavating our history is potentially that we're never known, that our truths are never known, our stories, our experiences, the way that we live. So I think amplification for me is the role. And that's what I try to drive through in my work.
And if I could just ask one quick follow-up, which is, how do you find given the erasure, where do you turn for your archive?
I guess this is about 2.5 years ago now, almost 3. I was taking self-portraits, and I was thinking about my own image and how I came to actualize, like in the physical sense, in my queerness and feel comfortable with what I'm seeing and feel like me. And I thought about coming up, I didn't have a lot of representations of mass presenting women that also are very in tune with their femininity and that have that fluidity with it. And so I went on a hunt. Where are the photos? Because we didn't just show up yesterday, and I couldn't find any. I found about 5 or 6, right? And that was like the culmination of as we were. And after that, it was really important for me to go and find more. And so to answer your question, I find a lot of my photographs on eBay from other online collectors. And I do get some donations from folks now that they know how I work. So a few places, but primarily eBay, which is a whole thing.
So you have to scour for this. And
yeah, it's a long process. And so when I think about making a work and making a series, like that is a part of that process.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the Queer.newark project is based on this same idea that we have to make this archive if it's not going to be so accessible. We have to make it if we can't find it. Though we can find it, and as your work shows, it just takes a lot of work. Well, we'll get back to that, but Noelle, do you want to jump in? Again, the question is about history. Well, for you, again, this is the heart of so much of what you do. All three of you, actually. History is a resource for a better future. And just thinking about the title of this program, Ancestors at Play, the beautiful title, and the Queer Archive. Do you want to tell us how your work engages with that?
Sure. First, I'm really happy to be here with all of you. So thank you for inviting me. Alanna, it was great to be introduced to your work and experience it. And I'm very excited about what you're doing and the discourses and conversations you're enabling during this period. So thank you for that. I believe my work comes from definitely Northeastern African-American perspective and cultural framework that at its heart has conversations with the ancestors as something that's a part of our culture or cultures that's expressed through our music and the way we gather as a community and the way that we are. And so even when I think of images like of being younger and, my cousins, meeting with folks from like Essence magazine and my cousin Lloyd being a part of like coming over to Newark and meeting with Amiri Baraka and a part of the Black arts movement. This was all a part of our history and our culture at that time. So it's not as if for me, it's something separate that I had to learn, but it's something that I was raised to understand. And then the second part is, as far as my work, I use Black women's lens, or a lens that amplifies the stories of African-American women as a way to understand what American identity means now. And so in that sense, for me, even though my work is not always articulating an overt queer discourse, it works to decenter a heterosexist, male-directed narrative by focusing on Black women speaking, Black women's lives, and Black women's culture. So that's pretty much what I have to say.
But you also, you both draw on your own family and your own ancestors and your own experience, but you also, I know, have done a great deal of pretty focused historical research on the 19th century. Do you want to say a few words about some of the projects that you've done? There's the one you're engaged in right now, the one you did on Black women suffrage activists in Newark. Just a little bit about how that work that people might not see as art, how that informs the rest of the work you do as an artist.
So can you all hear me? Or I feel like I might have to.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. So as far as my curatorial, like my work as a curator, my work as an artist, my work as a historian, and my work as a researcher, it's all intertwined. So even though for other people, it sometimes makes it easier for them to understand it in different kind of like segments or different aspects of me, it's all something I'm continuously doing all together at the same time. And in my life, I work to make it seamless. So as far as like my recent exhibitions that I curated, including Radical Women, where I was hired as a consultant to amplify the stories of women of color in New Jersey who were a part of the suffrage and voting rights movement. One of those things is that, you know, I've been invested in African American women's stories since I was about 13 or 14 years old. I used to lead a women of color cultural group in high school. You know, my senior thesis in undergrad was looking at the different forms of same-sex women's relationships that have existed in the 20th century. So I've had a definite investment in all of my work. I worked at a women's foundation that made grants to women of color throughout the United States. So all of my work has been focused on really highlighting African American women's stories, but also highlighting the stories that are least discussed. So, you know, one of my bead pieces is about Corinne Gaines, who was murdered in Maryland. So, you know, that's the trajectory of my work, and it's essential for me.
Thank you. Yeah, that's, I hope we could, maybe you could donate the essay you did in high school on same-sex relationships to the Queer Newark Archive. We've all, you know, that needs to get out there too. So,
Oh, sure.
I'm dying to see it myself. So, and it's just so cool you were doing that then. This is a brave high school kid. So, brave woman. But Naomi, if you could address the question about history as a resource. Again, I know it's something that you're deeply involved in, particularly bringing back Black queer writings, among other things. But the same question, you know, how does it inform your work as a poet, as a writer, as a researcher, and how you think about the title of this of our meeting here today, Ancestors that Play.
Well, thank you for that question. And I could just listen to both Alanna and Noelle just talk because you're both so interesting. Well, I'll say, you know, some of what Noelle said really resonated with me, of kind of doing all these different things, but they all kind of like make sense. And trying to make them seamless. And so I think in my poetry and in my academic research, I'm looking for models of like emancipated Black female sexuality. I think that's where I started, I should say, at least. And so my dissertation research, which hopefully I'll be done very soon with, I look at Black feminist engagement with the pro-sex movement of the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s a little bit too, through the work of non-canonical Black queer writers. And I think when I was playing with this as a kind of dissertation research topic, everyone pointed me to Audre Lorde. And then, you know, folks were like, of course, look, you know, Baldwin. And I was just like, yes, but what else? And so I think something, you know, through that work has been really rich and really important and informative. So some of three, just to say really quickly, the writers I look at, one is Red Jordan Erbateau, who I came across, at a visit to the Lesbian Her Story archives. And I was once upon a time really, really interested in street lit, and Red's work. So Red is a living Black trans writer. Red lives out on the West Coast. Red's work was just like, I loved the writing. Actually, I very much appreciate street lit, but also Red was writing around the same time as like Iceberg Slim, and you know, these like, who's like, you know, the father of, you know, street lit, like Donald Goines, those kind of people. So I was like, well, this is a completely new history of street lit, and that was really exciting for me. But I should also say that all the writers I look at, I'm really interested in them also because they write about sex explicitly. And so, when we talk about like Audre Lorde, it's like, yes, the erotic, okay, but like I'm interested in like raunch aesthetic. I'm interested in raunch culture. That's what I was, and I'm still really, really interested in too. And so the other writers, Anne Allen Shockley, who wrote Loving Her, who many kind of cite as like the first Black lesbian novel, was published in 74. And then there's Estée and Bogus. And so they're all connected. It's like this network of Black feminist writers doing this work where sex is kind of explicit in their writing. And so that's part of the history piece. But what's really interesting to me is also like a lot of this work is really personal. So as a writer, like I know all too well that the writers who are getting a lot of ink sometimes aren't the only ones. And they, so I really wanted to kind of think about Black feminist writing, Black queer art and literature as more cumulative. And I wanted to kind of steer away from this like kind of leading man or leading woman, these figures, and think differently and think more complexly. And also I find that this is a way to think about power within the literary establishment. So something I'm really into right now is thinking about the role of white patronage and white patrons, like with writers like, for example, James Baldwin, that like so heavily lauded. But there's like a really complex history that's attached to people like Baldwin that we don't talk about. So I think I'm really invested in telling fuller histories of the people that we are that are already very, very visible, and then kind of amplifying those who are not visible at all and connecting those narratives. So that's like the research piece. And then my chapbook is a memoir in verse, my poetry chapbook on Black girlhood and sexual discovery. So I think I'm working out some of this stuff on a more personal level there.
So interesting. Yeah, I read your piece about Red Jordan Arabato, and I was completely intrigued. And and you had pictures of him too, that I could see Alanna wanting to learn about these people. His writing is fabulous, and the little quote you had, and it was so exciting. And your point about the patronage networks is really fascinating. I know there's a scholar, Jacqueline Goldsby at Yale, who's working on some of this. Starting with, you think about Ann Petrie, who wrote The Street, which sold, mass market, like a lot of these writers, African-American writers who, did amazing work, but how their stuff got out is a big question, and whose doesn't is also a big question. So that's such an important intervention to think through the materiality of how things get out, as well as the content, and understanding that it's not, it's not like some kind of straightforward and easy thing where you produce it and it gets out. No. So it's totally fascinating, and I'm going to try and read more of everything you're finding out, because it's all mind-boggling and transformative of the canon. So thank you so much. And again, for all of you, there's this synthesis between, research and knowledge about a past that is hard to get at, and a transformation into a productive cultural engagement that people could connect to in all kinds of ways, whether it's, again, the kinds of installations and art that Noelle does, or the poetry that Naomi does, or the painting and lens-based work that Alanna does. If I wanted to just do one question for each of you that my students raised, and then we could turn to some of Emma's questions. Emma had some questions also, or if anybody wants to put something in the chat. But this was starting with Alanna again. My students were curious, a couple of things. now that we know a little bit more about the work you have to do to find images, they were very curious about how you select the specific photos for the Audacity series, what you look for when you choose to put something in there, whether you have a personal connection with the subjects of your photos, or if not, what is it in those photos that lends that makes you want it to give them the treatment that you do. So you could answer that.
Yeah, all great questions. I'll try to attack them as I remember them. So with Audacity, it was kind of a continuum from my earlier series, As We Were. As We Were was looking at early 20th century vernacular photography, really at the top of the century. And this quietude of queerness, this kind of hiding in plain sight, this these very veiled expressions of queerness, and then in some instances, a literal refutation of it inscribed in the image. But you know, these two people are lovers, and we think about safety and things like that. With Audacity, I really wanted to, it was the first series where I really scoured eBay to find this collection of photographs. And in those photographs, I was looking for things that, you know, exploded that quietude, exploded that hiding in plain sight, really images that bursted with fluid representations of masculinity and embodiments of masculinity and femininity. And I looked at Black queer men specifically for that. I wanted to see how gesture and the way that the body is presented in the image, singularly, without having a lover there to qualify what that relationship was. So I looked at aesthetic, I looked at gesture again, I look at gesture often, but I was also looking at environment and what did the home space look like? You know, these are not photographs that were taken in a photo booth. These were photographs that were set up in the home space where there's safety, like assured safety. And so what happens when we feel our most safe selves? How can we, you know, really be audacious with our expression? And so I looked for things that, you know, aligned with that had that energy. And these aren't family members or direct ancestors, but I feel tied to it in that I felt affirmed, and I also felt, okay, there was a moment where we had to keep it on the low, but finding this moment where that really exploded and we were able to like really venture into ourselves. I say we a lot because it feels like a we thing. That was a culmination of Audacity, and that's what I looked for in those images.
Yeah, that's powerful. Just the name Audacity is beautiful, and then the way you just described it is even more so. You know, you had the one picture that had crushed velvet as the name. Mm-hmm. Speaking of the background, which was so beautiful, and it sort of made you shift your focus and see that and think about what crushed velvet means as a self adornment or as a sort of self-representation. And you know, that was so powerful. And just also, you know, the way you painted particular colors to semi-obscure, was there a thought behind the color choice and the way you did that? Because it never entirely obscured in any way, but it did some.
Right. And I think what would be really great to see in my work is the veils kind of slowly melt away. And there'll always be a presence there, right? The wax serves as something not only to contain, but to preserve, but it also addresses historically the way in which Black queer history representation has been made invisible or quieted or fogged or been seen as a hyphenation to African American history rather than very much at the center of it. But yeah, so with the color choice, I wanted to bring out the vibrant colors that were already present, in the scene. But I also, in thinking about crushed velvet and that environment, I was thinking about my great grandmother's home spaces and these kind of cultural identifiers for African American homes, right? Because as much as I'm talking about queer history, I'm talking about Black history in general. And so these are things that I wanted to pull towards, but also something soft and luxurious as crushed velvet, and having that adorning or draping over this queer man with this very silky pompadour. I really wanted to tap into notions of Black aesthetic. And so that's where the color choice is coming from, but the veils showed up, or the wax showed up more as a wash over, a breaking through, rather than complete opacity.
Thank you. Yeah, that's, I think that's exactly how it functioned. And they're so powerful and they're so beautiful.
Thank you.
So I think, speaking of interiors, I think we should, the next question before Naomi, several people in the class watched your Inside the Laughing Barrel, which, if people haven't seen it, it's about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, I don't know, it goes fast, but it's a collaboration that Naomi did with two other artists, a dancer and a musician, set inside, they got access to Louis Armstrong's home. So we have the interior of that space. And they did this amazing mixed performance there with Naomi's poetry, all set, and the house itself is a character in this piece, the house of Louis Armstrong. And it's, has, so I want to ask you about that, Naomi. The question that my student raised, there were two. The student noticed that inside, it's called Inside the Laughing Barrel, which I'm curious about that title exactly. But it starts with the clip of an interviewer questioning Louis Armstrong in an accusatory tone about why he does so much, quote, clowning on the stage, unquote. So the question that my student raised is, did you conceive of this film piece that you did inside Louis Armstrong's home in Queens as a kind of a utopian escape from an alienating experience of being Black in mid-20th century America or any other time in America? How were you thinking about using that space, that interior space? It's very powerful in the film where there's the dancer is doing this intense dance and she never touches the walls, but it's narrow, but she makes it work, throughout the house is a character, when you give your poetry behind the veil of the shower curtain. I mean, it's amazing, the whole thing. So how are you conceiving of that? How did it relate to the setting and Louis Armstrong as a historical figure? And were there challenges or efforts to think about Louis Armstrong as a historical figure, his interior life, through the art that you put together with three Black women in that home, in that space?
Thank you for that question. So thinking about Louis Armstrong as a historical figure. So that is really interesting because as you mentioned, I was working, it was a commission with two other artists, and we did not agree, or I should say maybe I didn't agree on how to think about Louis Armstrong historically. So you're getting a lot from that. So there was this question that kept coming up about whether or not Louis Armstrong was radical. And I was like, and they had, kind of an idea of wanting to frame him, because this is last summer, right? And we know the events of last summer. And so I think there was this desire to frame him in that way. And I mean, yes, Louis Armstrong kind of did speak up, in the 1950s around the Little Rock Nine. But largely, I mean, he was seen by other African-American artists as sort of like a Tom. So it's really complicated. So what I did and what I wanted to do was be open to their thoughts about him as a radical, because I think there were some really interesting things there that they had to say, thinking about him as like performing and wearing a mask. But I decided to think about his wife, Lucille, and because I think a lot of times the wives and partners of jazz musicians get obscured or they're invisible. So I wanted to imagine what she would have to say. And there's plenty of video footage of her, but I wanted to think of her as having this like softer, more like even erotic energy. And then the other thing I, of course, was thinking about last summer is what they would have to say about like the George Floyd murder, about Breonna Taylor, about just all of this stuff that was happening. And so I kind of thought of them as ghosts and imagined them as through the home, kind of coming back. And Melanie Charles, who's just immensely talented, you can find her music on like, what is it, Tiny Desk, and she's just amazing. And, you know, Kayla Farris, they're just extremely talented, but it was really interesting to bring together these different understandings of this historical figure. And then me kind of leaning away from Louis Armstrong and being more intrigued by Lucille in some ways.
Yeah, there was one moment where you saw that painting of her that was so, and it, you know, it was kind of striking, but how about the interior of that space though? I mean, it's a pretty striking interior. And did you have any thoughts on what it meant to perform in that interior or just about that interior? As you know, one of the most successful Black performers of his day, and what he was expressing in there, and how you use that space.
Well, I'll say just quickly that, you know, being like in the throes, and we still are in the pandemic, you know, there were a lot of questions about being in the space. So I think it felt it felt very different than it might have felt under non-pandemic circumstances. But it was really, it was really what transformed the project. And it was really what kind of brought that kind of like haunted vibe, I think, when we got in there, because we shot it all at once, like there was no like dress rehearsal or anything. And we all just kind of sort of improvised and worked with each other. And I think it was the space that really dictated the direction we went in, and then what the videographer did later on with color and, you know, to kind of give it this kind of haunted energy. And the title Inside the Laughing Barrel is also a historical reference. So, and I don't know if it's true, but in the 19th century, and specifically during slavery, I've seen references to, enslaved folks having to put a barrel over their heads to laugh, to have pleasure. So this interiority is kind of like, going back to what Alanna was saying about safety, like where is it okay for Black pleasure to happen? I think sort of like, riffing off of that, I titled it.
Okay, fabulous. Yeah, I mean, something about the crushed velvet and Alanna's piece and the whole aesthetic in Louis Armstrong's home was very striking to me. So that's fascinating. That's and quite powerful, the title, which I did not know what it referred to. So Noelle, my student's question again. They asked, what do you hope to communicate? Well, there's two questions. What do you hope to communicate about Newark's history in your work? And in addition to dialoguing with the past, are you engaging with Afrofuturism, specifically hijacked the birth of Mala? Unmute, we need to unmute.
Sorry, I was not prepared to talk about my work today. So yeah, so let me reach over. Okay, my work. So as far as memory, I think memory is contiguous. So it's when I'm living, I'm also living the stories of my mother. I'm seeing things through that lens, you know? And I'm also living through the stories of my ancestors and my family. So in that way, it is Afrofuturist all the time because our framework is influenced by the people who have told us their stories. So in my work, it really speaks to these various overlappings of story making and memory and history in present day. So even for Black Power 19th century, I created these collages that are on the virtual exhibition. Christina will post a link. It's called Monumental Spaces. And in these collages, I show these Black Power sites on the Rutgers campus. And I reimagine them in a magical realist way. But they're the actual sites where this African-American community lived and had their churches, like on the Paul Robeson Center or where the field is now or in the parking lot. And so in that way, I continue to tell these stories. And yeah, in that way, it is Afrofuturist.
Did you want to share a little something with us that I think we have a time for if you want to try to do that.
Oh, sure. Okay. I wasn't sure because everyone is frozen on my side of the screen, so I'm having a really difficult time. But actually, what I wanted to show folks Are you all able to see this picture here? Hello? Oh. Hello? Okay.
We can hear you.
I think I got disconnected. Oh, okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. So basically, one of the things when I looked at Alanna's work, it made me think about obviously Black lesbian visibility in popular culture. And so I just wanted to share a couple of images with you all. That's actually not related to this work now, but the work when I was younger. So one of the images I'm showing is of Gladys Bentley. She was a performer in the 1940s, and she was often depicted in like a butch representation. Later on in the 1950s, Ebony magazine actually did this interesting spread where she renounced her butch presentation. And she said, "I'm a woman again." Basically, I just wanted to show you all some images of Black lesbian visibility over the past 20th century. And I also wanted to show a clip from Watermelon Woman, which is something that didn't come up today, but and I'm actually gonna put the link here. I'm not sure if your students have watched it, but one of the things that I think is interesting about Watermelon Woman, it's a movie that came out in 1996 by Cheryl Danier, and where she has a whole meeting space of what does it mean to be a Black woman artist? What does it mean to look into the archive? What does it mean to have these limited photographs of this history and to shape that history? And so it would just be great. I'm gonna post the link here, but I would really encourage all of the audience to check it out, because one of the things you'll be involved in a discussion that Black lesbians have been having for about the past 50 or 60 years around Black lesbian visibility that I think is really like essential for people to understand. So I'll just put it here in the chat because, yeah, so thank you.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and that film is amazing and it's directly on point. You know, it's exactly about how do you deal with an archive that excludes you and where does creativity come in? And it's a beautiful film. So thank you for finding that and sharing that with everyone who's here. I wanted to Emma, you had a question for the panelists, which I could ask it or you can, but it was about this question about visibility, legibility, and for whom. Emma, do you want to ask them the question, and then we'll give everyone a chance to answer?
I got to unmute here. The endless technical challenges. Can you hear me? Okay. I think that, I mean, each of you as our amazing panelists have touched upon this issue of visibility and legibility, and for whom, but I always love asking creative people, you know, is there something you haven't been asked to speak to? I'm sort of combining two of my questions here. So I come at legibility and visibility just not only as sort of a Gen X dyke, but also as a self-taught grant writer, where there's this pressure to make yourself or people you're advocating on behalf of legible and frankly digestible for those in power. So we've already talked a little bit about that, but if there's any other things that each of you have to share on this enormous topic.
Maybe we can go Alanna, Noelle, and Naomi.
Yeah, so I think, well, the first thing that you asked about, you know, is there something that, you know, we don't get asked enough or not at all? I remember, Emma, this was probably a few months back when we were thinking about, you know, how we could have a conversation, how we would shape it. And you asked me about the presence of queer women in my work, or rather, not a complete absence, but it overwhelmingly showing queer women, queer men. Mm-hmm. And that was the first time someone asked me that. Unfortunately, because it's a very intentional gesture, because in finding these photographs and searching for them, I overwhelmingly find queer men. I overwhelmingly find white queer women, but I underwhelmingly find Black queer women. And I think that there is a lot of meat there as to why. And it's something that I'd love to have a conversation more of. And I try to investigate that in my work by these intentional absences here and occasions where we see queer women. In my new work and in my upcoming show, you'll see a focal point of like Black queer woman freedom and joy, and this really explosion of it out in space and in nature. And I'd love to talk more about that. And so I think that that's the thing that I wish I was asked more. But around visibility and for who, I think I'm always creating visibility for us, and by us I mean Black queer people, for Black people, period. Because just because you're not queer does not mean that you don't need to have a relationship with queer history. And so I think my focal point is always creating visibility for us. And if, you know, people outside of that community engage with it, cool. If not, like, more of the same, you know, so
Fabulous. Noelle?
I'm not sure how I would answer that question. I think one of the things, the best way I could answer that would be that I wish when I encountered other people and speak with other people about my work, is that people were not so addicted to flattening Black life and flattening Black personalities. It's very hard for people in many ways to imagine Black people, particularly Black poor people, as full human beings and full spirits, whether I'm speaking to conservatives or whether I'm speaking to liberals. It's just hard, you know, like I did a mural with 4 corners where I put images up on Treat Street of 4 women who had their photographs taken in downtown Newark. And you know, people kept looking at it, and then this fellow artist came up to me and they said, well, you know, I'm sure all of these women, they must have all been rich or they must have all been privileged. And I was just like so surprised by that question, because it's like, can you not imagine that poor people might save their money to get a photograph of themselves taken? I mean, and over again, even when speaking with folks about African Americans in the 1800s here in Newark, and you know, the fact that some of them owned houses, some of them were poor, some owned houses, and a leading historian here in Newark said, well, too bad it's not like that now. You know, as if there aren't African Americans here in Newark who own houses. This country and many of the communities in this country are very committed to flattening Black life, making Black life as if it's like flat on a piece of paper, or almost like a fly that, you know, you've caught on the wall. And that, to me, is the hardest part of all of the work that I do, is this addiction to flattening Black life. And of course, it comes out the hardest on Black trans lives, Black poor women's lives, because it's just amazing. And so for me, that's the hardest part of being engaged in community, is that more than likely I'll have to have that conversation with someone 2 to 3 times a week, you know? So I don't necessarily have anything to say about what I wish people would ask me, but I do know what makes the work very hard. So that's it.
Thank you. And Naomi, you get the last word here.
No pressure. I'll just kind of add on to what Noelle was saying about this flattening of Black life. I think one of the things I didn't mention about the research that that I'm doing around these writers is that they're not known, they're not visible. But when I talk to folks who do know them, and this is, you know, it's across the color line, I often get, well, okay, well, like, we're not reading this stuff. Not often, but I have gotten several times that we're not reading this stuff because it's just not good. Right. And so there's this idea that like street lit it's just not good writing. It's not good literature. And in fact, all of the writers, I think, by both Black and white critics and heavily lauded, writers have just said it's not good. And the question that I have asked and I insist upon is good to who? Good for whom? And so, like with Red, I mean, I found in the archive, I found these letters that you know, were written to Red, were written to some of these writers, where you could see that people, you know, especially like Black queer folk, Black lesbians, immensely appreciated this work. And I should say working poor. And so that's something that I think makes this work and makes these histories much more legible is not just thinking about whether or not it's good, but for who or for whom.
Well, you did sum it up. That was beautifully said. And I think we might need to stop we have 1 hour, correct? So, but, we could obviously keep talking for another 3 because you all have so much to say. I'll just thank you all again. There's some comments on the side. One about Bayard Rustin only recently getting a posthumous honorary doctorate. There's so many people who've been excluded. I want to give a call out to New Millennium Butch, by the way, as a self-produced, beautiful visual record of Black queer women in Newark that can, join the archives that so many people right now are working so hard to retrieve and create and find. So thank you again to everyone. It was beautiful to hear you, and hopefully we'll be able to join again another time soon and hear more and more about your fabulous art and your great ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to echo that. Thank you all so very much. And a quick plug, the Newark LGBTQ Community Center is having their gala this evening. It's called Can You Imagine? It's volunteer-led. So please, if you are able to support, please do. I'm going to put that link in the chat, and it's starting right now. So thank you all so very much, and stay safe. And we hope to see you at future events.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your time and your vision. And don't forget Ratchet Supreme.
Yes.
19th century Black Power.
This is
Alanna Fields.
Naomi's new book, which is already award-winning. So just
indeed it is. Thank you again. And it'll be on our YouTube channel with Noelle. You will send me those images so I can put them in as if it was completely technical fluid.
All right.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.